In the dusty streets of Dry Hollow, 1887, a desperate cowboy named Elias Boone limped up to the grandest mansion in town. His boots were worn thin, his pockets empty, but his heart carried a burden heavier than any saddle. Inside that mansion lived Beatrice Langford, daughter of the railroad baron who owned half the territory. She had everything money could buy, yet felt trapped by the golden cage of her father's expectations. When Elias knocked on her door that fateful evening, he carried with him an impossible request that would shake the very foundations of their worlds. His dying sister needed expensive medical treatment he couldn't afford, and Beatrice faced an arranged marriage she couldn't escape. But what secret was Elias hiding that made this one-day marriage proposal so dangerous?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The sun had long since painted the western sky in shades of amber and rust when Elias Boone finally summoned the courage to approach the Langford estate. Dry Hollow stretched behind him like a weary old dog settling in for the night. It's wooden. Buildings casting long shadows across the dirt roads that had seen more horses than carriages, more dust than dreams. This was a town caught between two worlds, the fading frontier where men lived by the strength of their backs and the honesty of their word, and the coming age of steel rails and industrial fortunes that promised to change everything. The Langford mansion stood like a monument to that changing world, its 3 stories of painted white wood and wraparound, porches declaring prosperity in a land where most folks were grateful for a roof that didn't leak. Gas lamps flickered in the windows, casting a warm glow that spoke of comfort and security, things that had become as foreign to Elias as the fancy parlor furniture he glimpsed through the lace curtains. Elias paused at the wrought iron gate, his calloused hand resting on the cold metal as he gathered himself. His reflection stared back from the polished brass nameplate, a man of 32 who looked older, weathered by sun and hardship, his dark hair showing premature threads of silver at the temples. The limp in his left leg, a parting gift from an Apache lance 3 years past, had grown more pronounced as the evening grew cool. He wore his best clothes, a clean white shirt, pressed trousers, and a coat that had seen better days but was mended with care. His boots, though worn, were polished to a modest shine. A man might be poor, but he needn't look defeated. The weight of the worn leather journal in his coat pocket pressed against his ribs like a guilty conscience. Those pages held his deepest thoughts, his private struggles with the burden he now carried. More importantly, they contained the secret that made tonight's desperate mission both his only hope and his greatest shame. He'd written in that journal every day since Sarah had taken ill, documenting not just her decline, but his own growing desperation, his failed attempts to raise the money for her treatment, and the plan that had slowly formed in his mind like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. Sarah, his baby sister, though at 28 she'd laughed to hear him call her that. She'd been the light of their family since the day she was born, 15 years after him, when their parents had given up hope of more children. When fever and lung sickness had taken their mother and father within a year of each other, Sarah had been the reason Elias kept going. She'd made their little cabin a home, tending a garden that somehow coaxed vegetables from the stubborn soil, mending his clothes with threads of bright color that made him smile despite the hardships. Now she lay in that same cabin, growing thinner, each day as the consumption ate away at her lungs. Dr. Hammond had been clear. There was a specialist in Denver, new treatments that might save her, but they required more money than a struggling rancher could scrape together in a lifetime. $500 might as well have been $5,000 to a man whose best year had brought in barely enough to pay for seed and supplies. The irony wasn't lost on him that he stood now before the home of the richest family in 3 counties. A man with empty pockets seeking help from people who probably spent more on a single dinner party than he'd see in a year. But desperation makes philosophers of simple men, and Elias had reasoned through every other possibility until only this remained. Through the mansion's windows, he could see movement servants preparing for dinner, the soft glow of electric lights that still seemed like magic to someone accustomed to oil lamps and candles. Somewhere in those rooms lived Beatrice Langford, 26 years old, and, by all accounts, as beautiful as she was intelligent. More importantly for his purposes, she was unmarried and facing pressures of her own. He'd heard the talk in town, the way conversations quieted when certain topics arose. Miss Langford was expected to marry Preston Whitmore, son of another railroad. Family, a union that would merge two fortunes and solidify the Langfords' position in the territory's growing industrial empire. It was the sort of arrangement that made perfect sense to fathers concerned with legacy and business partners concerned with profit. What it meant to the young woman involved was a question that kept different sorts of people awake at night. Elias had seen Preston Whitmore on his visits to town, a soft man in expensive clothes who carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never known want or uncertainty. The kind of man who looked through working folks as if they were part of the scenery, neither worth notice nor consideration. Elias suspected that Miss Langford, raised by a father who'd built his fortune through determination and sharp dealing, might have thoughts of her own about such an arrangement. It was that suspicion, combined with his own desperate circumstances, that had led to the audacious plan now tucked away in his journal. A plan so unlikely, so dependent on the kindness and understanding of a woman he'd never met, that it bordered on madness. Yet here he stood, because sometimes madness was the only sane response to impossible circumstances. The evening air carried the scent of roses from the mansion's garden, a reminder of the careful cultivation that money could provide. His own land, inherited from his parents, consisted of scrub grass and rocky soil that barely supported a small herd of cattle. He'd worked it honestly for years, never quite getting ahead, but never falling too far behind, until Sarah's illness had changed everything. Now the ranch felt less like a home and more like a weight around his neck, its modest value insufficient to fund the medical care his sister needed. Mrs. Chun, the Langfords' housekeeper, had been kind when he'd made inquiries in town, a Chinese woman who'd found her way to Dry Hollow during the railroad construction. She'd built a reputation for discretion and competence that made her invaluable to the territory's wealthier families. She'd confirmed what he'd hoped, that Miss Langford often walked alone in the evenings, that she had a reputation for kindness to those less fortunate, and that she seemed less than enthusiastic about her pending engagement. Tom Rodriguez, his closest friend and one of the few people who knew the full extent of Sarah's condition, had called him loco when he'd outlined his plan. Tom, who'd served alongside him in the cavalry and understood both honor and desperation, had nevertheless shaken his head in disbelief. "Elias, my friend, you're talking about asking a woman you've never met to marry you for a day. Rich folks don't work that way. They've got lawyers and contracts and reputations to consider." But Tom hadn't sat beside Sarah's bed night after night, listening to her labored breathing and knowing that each day brought her closer to a death that money, the right amount of money, applied in the right way, could prevent. Tom hadn't held her hand while she apologized for being a burden, as if her life were somehow less valuable because it came with a cost they couldn't afford. The plan was simple in its desperation. Certain medical treatments and insurance policies required a married woman to have her husband's consent and financial backing. If Miss Langford would agree to a marriage of convenience, one day only, purely for legal and medical purposes, Sarah could receive the treatment she needed under the umbrella of the Langford family's resources and connections. It would cost Miss Langford nothing but a few hours of her time and the temporary inconvenience of a legal arrangement that could be quickly dissolved. In return, Elias would. What could a poor cowboy offer the daughter of a railroad baron? The question had tormented him for weeks as the plan took shape. Perhaps his willingness to dissolve the marriage immediately would be gift enough, a way for her to avoid, or at least delay the unwanted arrangement with Preston Whitmore. Perhaps she would see it as an adventure, a brief rebellion against the expectations that bound her as surely as poverty bound him. Or perhaps she would have him thrown off, property for his presumption. The sound of a door opening somewhere in the house brought him back to the present moment. Light spilled across the porch as someone stepped outside, and Elias felt his heart begin to race. This was it, the moment when months of planning and desperate hope would meet the reality of human nature and social convention. He straightened his shoulders, checked that his coat was properly buttoned, and pushed open the gate. The hinges whispered softly, a sound that seemed loud in the evening quiet. His boots clicked against the stone pathway that led to the front porch, each step carrying him further from the world he knew and closer to a conversation that would determine not just his sister's fate, but the direction of his own life. As he climbed the steps to the porch, Elias could hear voices from inside, the refined tones of people accustomed to comfort and certainty. Soon he would be among them, a rough man in a refined world, asking for something that no reasonable person should expect to receive. But love for his sister had carried him this far, and it would carry him through whatever came next. The brass knocker felt heavy in his hand as he prepared to announce himself to a world that had no reason to care about his troubles. In his pocket, the journal pressed against his ribs, a reminder of all the words he'd written in preparation for this moment, all the arguments and explanations and desperate pleas he'd rehearsed in the privacy of his cabin. But when the door opened and he found himself face to face with destiny, all those carefully planned words would matter less than the simple truth of two people recognizing something unexpected in each other's eyes. The door opened before Elias could complete his knock, revealing a middle-aged man in formal butler's attire, whose expression shifted from polite inquiry to obvious disapproval in the space of a heartbeat. The butler's gaze traveled from Elias's weather-beaten hat to his worn boots, cataloging every sign of his modest circumstances with the practiced eye of someone trained to distinguish between those who belonged in such surroundings and those who most decidedly did not. "I'm afraid the servant's entrance is around back," the butler said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to maintaining the social order. "If you're seeking employment, you'll need to return during daylight hours and speak with Mrs. Chun." Elias removed his hat, revealing hair that, while clean, bore the permanent marks of a man who spent his days under the open sky. "I beg your pardon, sir, but I'm not seeking employment. I was hoping to speak with Miss Langford, if she might spare a few minutes for a matter of some urgency." The butler's eyebrows rose in a way that suggested Elias had just announced his intention to sprout wings and fly. "Miss Langford is not receiving visitors this evening. If you have business with the family, you may leave your card, and someone will contact you at an appropriate time." "I don't have a card," Elias said, feeling the weight of that simple truth. In his world, a man's word and a firm handshake served purposes that apparently required printed formalities in this one. "But I assure you, the matter is urgent and concerns the welfare of someone very dear to me. I wouldn't presume to disturb the family's evening if there were any other way." The butler's expression made it clear that he'd heard such claims before and found them uniformly unconvincing. He began to close the door, but a voice from within the house stopped him. "Alfred, who is it?" The voice was cultured, unmistakably feminine, and carried a note of curiosity that seemed at odds with the formal atmosphere of the household. "I thought I heard someone at the door. It's no one of consequence, Miss Beatrice. A local man with some manner of business, he claims. Is urgent. I was just explaining our protocols for Alfred." The voice was closer now, and Elias could hear footsteps on what sounded like marble flooring. "How many times have I asked you not to turn people away without at least discovering what they need, especially when they've taken the trouble to come all this way in the evening?" The butler stepped aside with obvious reluctance as a woman appeared in the doorway, and Elias felt his carefully rehearsed words scatter like leaves in a strong wind. Beatrice Langford was indeed beautiful, but not in the delicate, ornamental way he'd expected from the daughter of wealth. Her beauty was more substantial, intelligent eyes, the color of deep water, auburn hair that caught the lamplight with hints of gold and copper, and a bearing that suggested strength rather than mere refinement. She wore a simple evening dress of deep blue silk that somehow managed to be both elegant and practical, and when she looked at him, he had the unsettling sensation that she was seeing more than his worn clothes and uncertain circumstances. "Good evening," she said, her voice warmer than her butler's had been. "I'm Beatrice Langford. Alfred says you have urgent business?" Elias struggled to find his voice, acutely aware that the next few minutes would determine whether his desperate plan had any chance of success. "Miss Langford, my name is Elias Boone. I realize this is highly irregular, and I apologize for disturbing your evening, but I find myself in circumstances that leave me no choice but to seek your help in a matter. That may sound ... unusual. Something in his tone must have conveyed the genuine nature of his desperation, because her expression softened slightly. What sort of help, Mr. Boone? Behind her, Alfred made a sound that suggested he strongly disapproved of this entire conversation, taking place on the front porch where neighbors might observe. Beatrice seemed to come to the same conclusion. Perhaps you'd better come inside, she said, stepping back to allow him entry. We can speak in the front parlor. Alfred's expression suggested that allowing this dusty cowboy into the formal parlor ranked somewhere between treason and sacrilege. But he stepped aside with the resigned air of a man who'd learned to pick his battles with his employer's headstrong. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive than Elias had imagined. The entrance hall soared upward to a second-floor balcony, its walls lined with oil paintings in heavy gold frames. A crystal chandelier cast warm light over furnishings that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. The floors were indeed marble, their surface so highly polished that they reflected the light like still water. Beatrice led him into a parlor that managed to be both luxurious and somehow comfortable, with deep leather chairs arranged around a fireplace where logs crackled cheerfully against the evening chill. She gestured to one of the chairs while taking a seat across from him, and Elias was grateful for the invitation to sit. His leg had begun to ache from the walk and the tension of the moment. Now then, Mr. Boone, she said, folding her hands in her lap with the graceful efficiency of someone accustomed to managing conversations. What sort of help brings you to my door on a Tuesday evening? Elias took a breath, knowing that everything depended on how well he could explain the impossible. Miss Langford, I have a sister, Sarah is her name, who is very ill. The consumption has taken hold of her lungs, and without proper medical treatment, she'll not see Christmas. Beatrice's expression grew more serious. I'm very sorry to hear that, Mr. Boone. Consumption is a terrible illness. Have you consulted with Dr. Hammond in town? I have, and he's been as helpful as his resources allow. But he's told me frankly that Sarah needs treatment from a specialist in Denver. New methods that might save her life, but require resources that are beyond my current means. He saw understanding dawn in her eyes, followed by what looked like sympathy. You're seeking financial assistance? Not exactly. Elias leaned forward, his hat turning nervously in his hands. The situation is more complicated than that. The treatments Sarah needs, the insurance policies that would cover them, they require certain legal arrangements that a single man cannot provide. Specifically, they require. He paused, knowing how his next words would sound. They require a married man with sufficient financial backing to guarantee payment. Beatrice's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Miss Langford, I've heard it said around town that you're facing an engagement you may not entirely welcome. I also understand that you're a woman of compassion who's known for helping those in need when circumstances allow. Mr. Boone, she said carefully, I'm not certain I understand what you're suggesting. Elias set his hat on the small table beside his chair and looked directly into her eyes. I'm suggesting a marriage of convenience, Miss Langford. One day only, purely for legal and medical purposes. Long enough to establish the legal standing required for Sarah's treatment, then dissolved immediately thereafter. The silence that followed stretched between them like a tightrope. Elias could hear the clock on the mantelpiece ticking, the distant sounds of servants preparing dinner, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He'd said it the impossible request that had driven him to her door. Now everything depended on how this remarkable woman would respond to a proposal that defied every convention of their time and place. Beatrice studied his face with an intensity that made him feel as if she were reading his character like the pages of a book. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than shocked. You're asking me to marry you for one day to save your sister's life? Yes, ma'am. And in return? This was the question Elias had dreaded, because the honest answer revealed just how little he had to offer. In return, Miss Langford, I would dissolve the marriage immediately and make no further claims on your time or attention. I realize it's presumptuous of me to suggest that such an arrangement might serve your purposes as well, but I've heard that your upcoming engagement is perhaps not entirely of your choosing. A flash of something surprise, perhaps, A recognition crossed her features. "You've certainly done your research, Mr. Boone. I apologize if I've overstepped. I'm not usually given to such bold actions, but Sarah is all the family I have left, and I'd do anything to save her life. Even something as desperate as this." Beatrice rose from her chair and walked to the window, gazing out at the evening landscape. When she turned back to face him, her expression was unreadable. "Tell me about your sister, Mr. Boone. What sort of person is she?" The question surprised him, but he answered readily. "Sarah is the finest person I've ever known. She's got a way of finding something good in every situation, no matter how difficult. When our parents passed, she could have married any number of young men who were courting her, could have had an easier life. Instead, she stayed to help me work the ranch and take care of the household. She reads everything she can get her hands on, knows more about poetry and literature than most educated folks. She's been teaching the local children to read when their parents can spare them from chores. She sounds remarkable. She is. And she deserves a chance to live, to marry someday, and have children of her own, to see what the world might hold. For her, all she needs is the right treatment, and she could have years ahead of her." Beatrice returned to her chair, but instead of sitting, she stood behind it with her hands resting on its back. "Mr. Boone, what you're proposing is highly irregular. It would require careful legal arrangements, absolute discretion, and a degree of trust between strangers that some might consider foolish." Elias felt his heart sink. She was preparing to refuse him, and he couldn't blame her. The request was outrageous by any reasonable standard. "However," she continued, and his head snapped up in surprise, "I find myself in a position where such an arrangement might indeed serve certain purposes of my own. My father is pressuring me to marry Preston Whitmore, a man I neither love nor respect, for reasons that have everything to do with railroad mergers and nothing to do with my happiness or well-being." She moved around the chair and sat down again, leaning forward with an expression of growing determination. "If I were to enter into a brief marriage with someone else, someone who has made it clear that he expects nothing beyond our agreement, would make my engagement to Mr. Whitmore impossible, at least temporarily. Long enough, perhaps, for me to find a more permanent solution to my circumstances." Elias stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying yes, Mr. Boone. I'll marry you for one day if it will save your sister's life and provide me with a respite from my father's matchmaking efforts." Relief flooded through him so suddenly that he felt lightheaded. "Miss Langford, I don't know how to thank you. This means everything to me, to Sarah... "Don't thank me yet," she said with a slight smile that didn't quite hide the uncertainty in her eyes. "We'll need to work out the details very carefully. The marriage will need to be legal and properly documented for medical purposes, but we'll also need to ensure it can be dissolved quickly and quietly. And Mr. Boone?" "Yes, Mom?" "If we're going to be married, even briefly, you should probably call me Beatrice." As Elias looked into her eyes, seeing kindness, intelligence, and perhaps a hint of the same desperate courage that had brought him to her door, he realized that his simple plan to save his sister's life had just become infinitely more complicated, because somewhere between her agreement to help him and her invitation to use her given name, he'd begun to suspect that one day might not be nearly enough. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the mountains seem close enough to touch, though Elias felt as if he were moving through a dream where familiar things had taken on strange new meanings. He sat at the small wooden table in his cabin, staring at the marriage certificate template that Beatrice, he was still getting used to thinking of her by her given name, had given him the night before. The document looked official and imposing, its formal language making their extraordinary arrangement seem both more real and more surreal. Sarah stirred in the bed across the room, her breathing labored but steady. She'd been having a good morning, alert enough to tease him about his distracted state and ask pointed questions about where he'd gone the previous evening. He'd told her only that he was working on a solution to their problem, unwilling to reveal the full scope of his plan until he was certain it would work. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention to the window, where he saw a small carriage making its way up the rough track to his cabin. His heart began to race as he recognized the Langford family's modest traveling coach, not the grand carriage used for formal occasions, but the practical vehicle Beatrice apparently used for her charitable visits around the territory. Mrs. Chun sat beside the driver, her weathered face impassive as always, while inside the carriage he could glimpse Beatrice herself, dressed in a simple traveling dress of dark green wool. The sight of her in his humble surroundings seemed to emphasize the vast difference between their worlds, and for a moment he wondered if she might have come to tell him she'd reconsidered. Elias? Sarah's voice was weak, but curious. Who's coming? To call? I thought I heard a carriage. Just someone who might be able to help with your medical situation, he said, moving to help her sit up against the pillows he'd arranged behind her. I may have found a way to get you the treatment Dr. Hammond recommended. Sarah's eyes brightened with hope, though her expression remained skeptical. What sort of way? You haven't done anything foolish, have you? Before he could answer, a knock came at the door. Elias smoothed his hair, checked that his shirt was properly tucked, and opened it to find Beatrice standing on his small porch, with Mrs. Chun slightly behind her. In the bright morning light, she looked even more remarkable than she had the night before, though he noticed she seemed nervous, her hands fidgeting with the small reticule she carried. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she said formally, though her eyes conveyed a warmth that hadn't been there during their initial meeting. "I hope you don't mind the early visit, but I thought we should discuss the practical arrangements for our ... agreement. Of course, please come in." He stood aside to let her enter, acutely aware of how small and plain his cabin must seem to someone accustomed to mansion living. The single room served as kitchen, parlor, and his sleeping area, with Sarah's bed occupying the space near the fireplace where the warmth was best. His few possessions, books, tools, the hand-carved wooden horse he'd made for Sarah years ago, were arranged with military precision born of cavalry training and necessity. Mrs. Chun remained on the porch, but Beatrice stepped inside and immediately moved toward Sarah's bed, her manner becoming gentle and concerned. "You must be Sarah. I'm Beatrice Langford. Your brother spoke of you with such affection last evening." Sarah's eyes widened as she took in their unexpected visitor. "Miss Langford? The railroad baron's daughter? What brings you to our humble cabin?" Beatrice glanced at Elias, who realized he needed to explain at least part of his situation. "Sarah, Miss Langford has agreed to help us with your medical treatment. The arrangement is somewhat unconventional, but it should allow you to see the specialist in Denver." Unconventional how? Sarah's intelligence was one of the things Elias loved most about her, but at the moment he wished she were less perceptive. Beatrice sat carefully on the edge of the bed, her silk dress a stark contrast to the simple quilts their mother had sewn years ago. "Sarah, your brother has proposed a business arrangement that would benefit us both. A temporary legal arrangement that would allow you to receive medical treatment under my family's insurance and connections." Sarah looked between them, her gaze sharp despite her illness. "What sort of legal arrangement requires both of you to look so nervous?" Elias sighed, realizing there was no way to hide the truth from someone who knew him so well. "A marriage, Sarah. One day only, purely for legal and medical purposes. Miss Langford has kindly agreed to help us." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and Sarah's labored breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of amazement and concern. "Elias Boone, are you telling me you convinced this lovely young woman to marry you to help a sister you've never met?" "I convinced myself, actually," Beatrice said with a slight smile. "Your brother made a very compelling case, and I have my own reasons for finding such an arrangement beneficial." Sarah studied Beatrice's face with the same intensity Elias had noticed the night before, as if she were reading character rather than features. "And after one day, you'll simply dissolve this marriage and go your separate ways?" "That's the plan," Elias said, though even as he spoke the words, something in his chest tightened at the thought. Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "It's a generous thing you're doing, Miss Langford. I'm more grateful than I can express. But I have to ask, are you certain you thought this through? Marriage, even a temporary one, is not something to be entered into lightly." Beatrice's composure wavered slightly, revealing the uncertainty she'd been hiding. "I'll admit, Sarah, that I've had some reservations. The arrangement is highly unusual, and there are social implications to consider. But sometimes circumstances require unusual solutions. What circumstances? Sarah asked gently. Beatrice hesitated, then seemed to decide that honesty was the best approach. My father is pressuring me to marry someone I don't love, for business reasons that have nothing to do with my happiness. A temporary marriage would give me time to find a better solution to my situation. Sarah nodded slowly, her expression growing more sympathetic. So you're both trapped by circumstances in different ways. It seems so, Beatrice agreed. Sarah looked at her brother with an expression he couldn't quite read. Elias, would you mind fetching some water from the well? I'd like to speak with Miss Langford privately for a moment. Elias felt a flash of panic at the idea of leaving the two women alone. He had no idea what Sarah might say, and their entire plan depended on Beatrice's continued cooperation. But Sarah's tone brooked no argument, and he could hardly refuse such a simple request. Of course, he said, taking the water bucket from its hook by the door. I'll just be a moment. Outside, Mrs. Chun sat in the carriage, her expression unreadable as always. She nodded politely as he passed, but said nothing. The well was only a short distance from the cabin, but as he worked the handle to bring up the bucket, he found himself straining to hear voices from inside. The thick log walls prevented him from making out words, but he could hear the low murmur of conversation. When he returned, both women looked up with expressions that seemed somehow more settled than when he'd left. Sarah appeared less concerned, while Beatrice looked more determined, as if some internal conflict had been resolved. Everything all right? He asked, setting the bucket by the washstand. Miss Langford and I have had a very illuminating conversation, Sarah said with a slight smile. I believe your plan may work very well indeed. Beatrice rose from the bed, smoothing her skirts. We should discuss the practical details. The ceremony will need to take place tomorrow morning. I've arranged for Pastor Williams to meet us at the small chapel outside town at sunrise. Mrs. Chun will serve as witness, along with Dr. Hammond, whom I've already spoken with about the medical arrangements. Dr. Hammond knows about this? Elias asked. He understands that you'll be acquiring the legal status necessary for Sarah's treatment. The details of how that status is achieved are not his concern, as long as the proper documentation is provided. Elias felt a flutter of anxiety at how quickly everything was moving. And after the ceremony? We'll need to complete the insurance paperwork and schedule Sarah's consultation with the specialist. I've already sent a telegram to Denver. Dr. Morrison can see her next week if we can arrange transportation. The efficiency with which Beatrice had organized everything was impressive, but it also made their arrangement feel more real and more temporary at the same time. This was clearly a business transaction to her, managed with the same competence she probably brought to all her charitable endeavors. There's one more thing, Beatrice said, her tone becoming more serious. My father doesn't know about this arrangement yet. I'll need to tell him after the ceremony, when it's too late for him to interfere. That means we'll need to be prepared for some unpleasantness from both my family and Preston Whitmore. I don't want to cause trouble for you, Elias said. You won't be causing it. You'll simply be providing me with an excuse to delay trouble. That was already coming. As they finalized the details of their extraordinary plan, Elias found himself watching Beatrice with growing admiration. She was clearly nervous about what they were undertaking, but her determination to help Sarah and escape her own unwanted engagement had transformed her from a sheltered heiress into something approaching a co-conspirator when she finally prepared to leave. Sarah called her over for a private word. Elias watched as his sister took Beatrice's hand and spoke to her in low tones, too quiet for him to hear. Whatever she said brought a look of surprise to Beatrice's face, followed by something that might have been gratitude. What did you tell her? Elias asked after the carriage had disappeared down the track. Sarah smiled mysteriously. Just some advice about marriage, even temporary ones. Sometimes the most important things can't be planned in advance, brother. Dear, sometimes you have to trust in the possibility that life might surprise you. As Elias prepared for what would either be the most successful or most disastrous day of his life, he found himself wondering if Sarah's words carried more wisdom than either he or Beatrice were prepared to acknowledge. The sunrise ceremony at the small chapel took place in a hush that seemed to amplify every sound. The rustle of Beatrice's simple blue dress, the creak of the wooden pews, Pastor Williams clearing his throat as he opened his worn Bible. Elias stood beside her in his best clothes, freshly pressed and carefully mended, trying to reconcile the surreal nature of what they were doing with the very real legal documents they would sign. Afterward, Mrs. Chun sat in the front pew, her presence lending an air of respectability to the proceedings, while Dr. Hammond waited, near the back with his medical bag and a folder of insurance forms. The chapel itself was modest, built by the community for those who couldn't afford the grandeur of the main church in town, but the morning light streaming through its simple windows gave everything a golden, ethereal quality that made their practical arrangement feel unexpectedly sacred. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent officiating at life's most important moments. "We are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Elias felt Beatrice's hand tremble slightly in his as they stood before the altar. When he glanced at her, he saw that her composure, so perfect during their planning sessions, had given way to something more vulnerable. Her eyes met his, and he saw in them the same mixture of determination and uncertainty that he felt churning in his own chest. The vows were traditional, spoken in voices that started uncertain but grew steadier with each word. When Pastor Williams asked if he would take Beatrice as his wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, Elias found himself meaning the words more than he'd expected to. And when Beatrice promised to love, honor, and cherish him, her voice carried a sincerity that suggested she too was surprised by the gravity of the moment. "You may kiss the bride," Pastor Williams said finally, and Elias realized they hadn't discussed this part of the ceremony. He looked at Beatrice questioningly, and she nodded almost imperceptibly before tilting her face up toward his. The kiss was brief, chaste, intended for the sake of propriety rather than passion. But when their lips met, Elias felt something shift inside him, a recognition that this woman, brilliant, brave, willing to risk social scandal to help a stranger's sister, was remarkable in ways that had nothing to do with her father's wealth or her position in society. When they separated, Beatrice's cheeks were flushed, and she looked as startled as he felt. They turned to face their small audience, officially husband and wife, for what was supposed to be the next 24 hours. And Elias wondered how something that had begun as pure necessity was already becoming something more complicated. Paperwork that followed was extensive. Dr. Hammond had prepared insurance documents that would cover Sarah's treatment, forms that required Elias's signature as her brother and guardian, and Beatrice's signature as his wife and financial guarantor. Each document they signed made their temporary union more legally binding and, paradoxically, more emotionally significant. "The specialist in Denver is expecting Mrs. Boone." Dr. Hammond paused, looking at Sarah, who had insisted on attending despite her weakness. "I mean, he's expecting Miss Sarah next week. With these documents, she'll have access to the latest treatments, including the new sanitarium protocols that have shown remarkable success." Sarah, wrapped in blankets and supported by pillows they'd arranged in the chapel pew, looked between her brother and his new bride with an expression of wonder and growing affection. "I still can't believe you've done this for someone you barely know," she said to Beatrice. "Perhaps," Beatrice replied, "but I'm beginning to feel like I know you both better than I expected to." After the ceremony, they returned to the Boone cabin to collect Sarah's belongings for the journey to Denver. Elias had arranged for Ton Rodriguez to drive them in his larger wagon, since the trip would be easier for Sarah than the jostling she'd endure in Elias's old BUC-KB OARD as they prepared for departure. Beatrice surprised them both by insisting on accompanying them to Denver. "The insurance requires a family member to oversee treatment decisions," she explained, though Elias suspected her motives were more personal than practical. "And I've never been to Denver. It seems like an appropriate destination for a honeymoon." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither had expected when they'd planned their arrangement. Tom, loading Sarah's few belongings into his wagon, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He'd known Elias long enough to recognize when his friend was in deeper waters than he'd intended to navigate. The journey to Denver took 2 days, with an overnight stop at a way station that tested the boundaries of their arrangement. Elias had assumed they would maintain separate accommodations, but the station had only one room available, with a single bed and a chair that could serve as makeshift sleeping arrangements. "I'll take the chair," Elias said immediately, but Beatrice shook her head. "Don't be ridiculous. We're supposed to be married. Separate sleeping arrangements would raise questions we don't want to answer." She paused, looking around the modest room. "Besides, the bed is large enough for 2 people to sleep without ... impropriety." That night, as they lay on opposite sides of the bed with Sarah sleeping peacefully on a cot nearby, Elias found himself acutely aware of Beatrice's presence. She wore a simple nightgown that covered her completely, and they'd arranged a row of pillows between them like a fortress wall. But he could hear her breathing, sense the warmth of her body, feel the subtle movement of the mattress when she shifted position. "Elias?" she whispered into the darkness. "Yes? Are you having second thoughts about this?" He considered the question carefully. The honest answer was complicated, because while he wasn't having second thoughts about helping Sarah, he was definitely having unexpected thoughts about the woman lying beside him. About helping Sarah? Never. About the rest of it, ... He paused, searching for words that would be honest without being presumptuous. "I find myself wondering if one day will be enough." He felt her go very still beside him. "Enough for what?" "To properly thank you for what you've done. To understand why someone with every advantage in life would risk social scandal to help strangers. To..." He stopped himself before he could say something that might make her uncomfortable. "To what?" "To know you," he said finally. "Really know you, not just the arrangement we've made." The silence stretched between them, broken only by Sarah's steady breathing and the distant sounds of other travelers settling in for the night. When Beatrice finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "I've been wondering the same thing. About you, I mean. You're not what I expected when I agreed to this plan." "What did you expect?" "Someone more. Mercenary, I suppose. Someone who would see this as purely transactional. But you're not like that, are you? You genuinely care about people, even people you've just met." Elias turned slightly toward her voice, though he couldn't see her face in the darkness. "Is that a problem?" "I don't know," she admitted. "It makes everything more complicated than I planned for." The next morning brought them to Denver, where the specialist Dr. Morrison confirmed Dr. Hammond's diagnosis, but offered hope in the form of new treatments that might arrest Sarah's condition and even restore much of her health. The procedures would take several weeks, requiring Sarah to remain in Denver under medical supervision as they settled Sarah into the sanitarium. Modern facility with electric lights and the latest in medical equipment. Elias found himself facing the reality that their one-day marriage had already extended beyond its original scope. More troubling still, he was discovering that he didn't want it to end. Beatrice seemed to be wrestling with similar feelings. During their visits to Sarah, she displayed a natural warmth and compassion that had nothing to do with duty or charity. She read to Sarah from books of poetry, shared stories of her own travels, and listened with genuine interest to Sarah's observations about everything from the changing social landscape to her hopes for recovery. "She's going to be fine," Beatrice said on their third evening in Denver, as they walked back to their hotel from the sanitarium. "Dr. Morrison says her response to treatment is better than expected." "Thanks to you," Elias said. "I can never repay what you've done for us." Beatrice stopped walking and turned to face him under the glow of a gas street lamp. "What if I don't want repayment? What if I want something else entirely? What do you want?" She looked at him for a long moment, her expression vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before. "I want to know what happens if we don't dissolve this marriage tomorrow. I want to see where this leads, even though it terrifies me." Elias felt his heart begin to race. Beatrice ... "I know we agreed to one day. I know this wasn't supposed to become real. But it has become real, hasn't it? At least for me." "Yes," he said simply. "For me, too." As they stood there in the Denver street, looking at each other with new understanding, Elias realized that their carefully planned arrangement had become something neither of them had anticipated. What had begun as desperation and convenience was transforming into something that felt dangerously close to love. The question now was whether they had the courage to let it continue, despite all the obstacles that stood in their way. Their return to Dry Hollow 3 days later came with the weight of unspoken decisions, and the knowledge that their one-day arrangement had already stretched far beyond its original boundaries. Sarah remained in Denver under Dr. Morrison's care, her treatment progressing better than anyone had dared hope, but her absence left Elias and Beatrice alone together in a way that made their changed relationship impossible to ignore without the photograph. Elias kept on his small mantelpiece himself in cavalry uniform, with his late parents seemed to watch them as they sat at his kitchen table, sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and preserved fruit that Beatrice had insisted on preparing. She moved through his modest kitchen with surprising competence, her expensive dress protected by one of Sarah's aprons, and Elias found himself mesmerized by this glimpse of what domestic life with her might be like. "You're staring," she said, without turning around, though he could hear the smile in her voice. "I'm trying to reconcile the woman who organized a medical miracle in 3 days with the one who's currently darning my shirt." Beatrice looked up from the mending in her lap, needle poised in mid-stitch. "Perhaps you don't know me as well as you think you do. Perhaps I'd like to know you better." The words hung between them like a bridge. Neither was quite ready to cross. Their marriage might have been born of convenience, but the feelings developing between them were becoming inconveniently real. Each shared meal, each conversation that revealed new depths to the other's character, each moment when their hands brushed accidentally, all of it was building into something that felt too significant to dismiss when their 24 hours expired. A knock at the door interrupted the growing intimacy of the moment. Elias opened it to find Tom Rodriguez, hat in hand, an expression troubled. "Sorry to disturb you, amigo, but we've got a problem. Preston Whitmore was in town today, asking questions about your trip to Denver. And he wasn't asking politely." Beatrice rose from her chair, her face growing pale. "What sort of questions?" "The sort that suggest he knows about your marriage," Tom said grimly. "He was at the hotel, talking to the clerk about who accompanied you on your journey. He also visited Pastor Williams." Elias felt his stomach drop. They'd known this moment would come when Beatrice's father and her intended fiancé learned about their arrangement, but he'd hoped for more time to figure out how to handle the inevitable confrontation. "How much does he know?" Beatrice asked. "Enough to be furious," Tom replied. "He's been telling anyone who'll listen that you've been compromised by a fortune-hunting cowboy, and that he intends to rectify the situation." Beatrice sank back into her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I should have anticipated this. Preston has always been possessive, even before our engagement was formally announced. There's more," Tom continued reluctantly. "Your father received a telegram from someone in Denver. Word is he's on his way here, and he's bringing lawyers." The implications hit Elias like a physical blow. Beatrice's father wasn't just coming to retrieve his daughter. He was coming armed with legal documentation that could potentially invalidate their marriage, challenge the insurance arrangements for Sarah's treatment, and destroy everything they'd worked to accomplish. "I should go," Beatrice said quietly. "If I return home now, before he arrives, perhaps I can explain the situation calmly. Make him understand that this was necessary to help Sarah." "No." Elias's voice was sharper than he'd intended. "You're not going back there to face his anger. Alone. We're in this together. Elias, you don't understand what my father is capable of when he feels his authority has been challenged. He built his railroad empire by crushing obstacles, not negotiating with them, and we'd better be prepared for a fight." That evening, as they waited for the storm to break, Elias and Beatrice found themselves drawn into the kind of deep conversation that revealed the foundations of character. Sitting by the fireplace, sharing the warmth of the flames and the intimacy of honest words, they began to understand each other in ways that went far beyond their original practical arrangement. "Tell me about your parents," Beatrice said, nodding toward the photograph on the mantel. Elias followed her gaze to the faded image of his younger self, flanked by a weathered man and a woman whose eyes held the same gentle strength he saw in Sarah. They were good people. Simple people, I suppose some would say, but they understood what mattered. "My father fought in the war between the states came home changed, but determined to build something better. My mother could make a feast from prairie grass and hope, and somehow convince you it was the finest meal you'd ever eaten. They'd be proud of what you've done for Sarah. I hope so. He paused, studying Beatrice's face in the firelight. What? About your mother? You never speak of her. Beatrice's expression grew distant. She died when I was 12. Cancer, though they didn't have good treatments then. Nothing like what Sarah's receiving now. My father. He loved her deeply, and when she died, something in him hardened. He threw himself into business, into building the railroad empire she'd never see completed. I think he's spent the last 14 years trying to construct a legacy, grand enough to honor her memory. And your place in that legacy is to marry well, produce grandchildren who will carry on the family name and serve as a proper ornament to his success. Her voice carried a bitterness that spoke of years of feeling valued more for her social utility than her individual worth. Preston Whitmore represents everything my father believes I should want: wealth, social position, connections that will advance the family business, but not love. Preston doesn't believe in love, at least not the kind that involves seeing your partner as an equal. He believes in possession, in acquiring beautiful things that reflect well on his status. She looked directly at Elias. It's taken me this long to understand that love should be about recognizing the poetry in someone's soul, not the value of their social connections. The words seemed to surprise her as much as they did him, and Elias felt something shift in Digny. The air between them. They were no longer talking around their feelings or pretending that their marriage was purely practical. Beatrice, he said carefully, when your father arrives tomorrow with his lawyers and his threats, you'll have a choice to make. You can return to the life that was planned for you, marry Preston Whitmore, and forget this ever happened. Or, or, you can choose something different. Something that might not come with guarantees or social approval, but might offer something more valuable. What are you saying? Elias took her hands in his, feeling the smoothness of her skin against his own. Work-roughened palms. I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Beatrice. Not with your father's money or your social position, but with the woman who was brave enough to marry a stranger to save his sister's life. The woman who reads poetry to sick patients and darns shirts she doesn't need to mend. Tears gathered in her eyes, but her voice was steady when she spoke. I've fallen in love with you too, with the man who would risk everything for his sister, who treats a poor Chinese housekeeper with the same respect he shows a railroad baron's daughter, who sees beauty in simple things and finds poetry in everyday moments. As they sat there in the firelight, hands clasped and hearts finally open to each other, they both understood that tomorrow would bring a reckoning that would determine not just their immediate future, but the entire direction of their lives. The practical arrangement that had brought them together was about to be tested by forces neither of them could fully control. But tonight, in the warmth of his simple cabin with honest words finally spoken between them, they had something worth fighting for. Something that transcended social expectations and practical considerations. Something that felt, for the first time in either of their lives, like the beginning of true happiness. The question was whether they would have the courage to fight for it when the world tried to tear it away. The confrontation came with the dawn, announced by the thunderous approach of multiple carriages and the sharp commands of men accustomed to having their orders followed without question. Elias had been awake since before sunrise, standing at his window and watching the eastern horizon for signs of trouble. When the dust cloud appeared in the distance, he knew their brief respite was over. Beatrice stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and together they watched her father's impressive entourage approach. The lead carriage was the Langford family's finest black, lacquer and brass fittings that gleamed even in the early morning light, followed by a second vehicle that undoubtedly carried the lawyers Tom had warned them about. A third carriage, smaller but no less elegant, completed the procession, and Elias suspected it carried Preston Whitmore himself. He's brought quite an army, Beatrice observed, her voice steady despite the circumstances. My father never believed in subtle approaches to problem-solving. Are you ready for this? She turned to look at him, and Elias saw in her eyes the same determination that had led her to accept his impossible proposal just a few days ago. I've been preparing for this my entire life, even if I didn't know it. The question is whether I'm brave enough to see it through. The carriages came to a halt in front of the cabin with military precision, and Charles Langford emerged from the lead vehicle like a force of nature, barely contained in human form. Even at 60, he was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they observed. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his bearing that of a man who had built an empire through sheer determination and an unwillingness to accept defeat. Behind him came 2 men in dark suits carrying leather portfolios, the lawyers who would undoubtedly attempt to unravel the legal knots that protected Sarah's medical treatment. And from the third carriage stepped Preston Whitmore, his handsome face twisted with an anger that made him look petulant rather than powerful. Elias opened the cabin door before they could knock, stepping out onto the porch to face them. Beatrice followed, positioning herself slightly behind him, but clearly visible to her father. The morning air was crisp and still, carrying the tension of the confrontation like an approaching thunderstorm. "Mr. Langford," Elias said with a respectful nod, "I assume you've come to discuss the recent changes in your daughter's circumstances." Charles Langford's gaze fixed on him with the intensity of a hawk studying potential prey. "I've come to rectify a situation that never should have been allowed to develop. Beatrice, you will gather your belongings immediately. We're returning home, where this unfortunate episode can be properly addressed." "Good morning, Father," Beatrice said calmly, making no move to obey his command. "I trust your journey from town was pleasant? The morning is quite beautiful." The casual greeting seemed to surprise Langford, as if he'd expected tears or apologies rather than composure. Preston Whitmore, however, had no patience for pleasantries. "Beatrice, what in God's name did you think you were doing?" he demanded, his voice rising with each word. "Marrying some dirt-poor cowboy like a common Mr. Whitmore?" Elias interrupted, his tone polite but carrying an undertone of steel. "I'd ask you to be careful with your words when speaking about my wife." The simple claim of relationship hit the assembled group like a physical blow. Charles Langford's face darkened, while Preston looked as if he'd been slapped. One of the lawyers stepped forward, consulting his papers. "Actually, Mr. Boone, that's precisely what we're here to discuss. This alleged marriage was conducted under false pretenses, without proper consent from Miss Langford's family, and appears to have been motivated by fraudulent intent to gain access to family resources." Beatrice moved to stand beside Elias, her posture radiating the dignity she'd inherited from generations of strong-willed ancestors. "I was not aware that I required my father's consent to enter into marriage at the age of 26, and I can assure you that my decision was made freely and with full understanding of the circumstances. Circumstances that involved deceiving you about this man's true intentions," Charles Langford said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment. "Beatrice, you've been manipulated by a fortune hunter who saw an opportunity to exploit your charitable nature." "Have I?" Beatrice's tone remained calm, but Elias could see the fire building in her eyes. "And what evidence do you have of this manipulation, Father?" One of the lawyers opened his portfolio and withdrew a sheaf of papers. "We've conducted an investigation into Mr. Boone's circumstances. His ranch is mortgaged beyond its value. His sister's medical expenses have created debts he cannot possibly repay, and his financial situation is desperate enough to drive him to extraordinary measures. All of which," Beatrice replied, "was explained to me before I agreed to help. I entered into this arrangement with full knowledge of Elias's circumstances and my own reasons for finding it beneficial." Preston stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and wounded pride. "Your reasons?" "Beatrice, we had an understanding." "No, Preston, you and my father had an understanding. I was simply expected to comply with an arrangement made without consulting my feelings or preferences." The empty medicine bottle that had once held Sarah's laudanum sat on the porch railing where Elias had placed it that morning, a reminder of how fragile life could be and how much their arrangement had already accomplished. The sight of it strengthened his resolve to protect what they'd built together. "Mr. Langford," Elias said, addressing the older man directly, "I understand your concern for your daughter's welfare. Any father would share those feelings. But I think you're underestimating both Beatrice's intelligence and her strength of character. I'm not interested in your opinions about my daughter's character, Langford snapped. I'm interested in ending this farce before it causes irreparable damage to her reputation and my family's standing in the community. The only damage to my reputation, Beatrice said firmly, would come from allowing myself to be bullied into abandoning someone who has shown me more genuine respect and affection in a few days than I've received in years of your matchmaking efforts. The words hung in the morning air like a challenge thrown down at her father's feet. Charles Langford's expression grew even darker, while Preston looked as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Beatrice, her father said, his voice dropping to a more dangerous tone, you will come home with me now. This marriage will be annulled, and you will fulfill your obligations to Preston and this family. This is not a request, and if I refuse, then you will discover how thoroughly a determined man can complicate the life of someone who defies him. Mr. Boone's sister, for instance, might find her medical treatment suddenly unavailable if certain insurance policies were to be challenged in court. The threat hit Elias like a physical blow, but before he could respond, Beatrice stepped forward with a fury he'd never seen before. How dare you threaten an innocent woman's life to control my choices? How dare you use Sarah's illness as a weapon? Against me? I dare because I'm your father, and I know what's best for your future. This infatuation with noble poverty will pass, but the consequences of this reckless marriage could last a lifetime. Elias felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd known this moment would come, when his love for Beatrice would be weighed against Sarah's life, when his desire for happiness would conflict with his duty to protect his sister. The choice seemed impossible, yet crystal clear. Mr. Langford, he said quietly, if dissolving this marriage is the price of ensuring Sarah's continued treatment, then I'll sign whatever papers your lawyers have prepared. Elias, no, Beatrice began, but he touched her hand gently. Sarah's life comes first, Beatrice. It has to. How noble, Preston said with a sneer. And how convenient that your nobility leads you directly to the outcome we desired. But Charles Langford was studying his daughter's face with the sharp intelligence that had built his business empire. He saw something there that made him pause, a determination that reminded him, perhaps, of her late mother. There is, he said slowly, another possibility. Before Charles Langford could elaborate on his mysterious other possibility, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the tense confrontation. A single rider was approaching at considerable speed, his horse lathered with sweat and dust, suggesting urgent business that couldn't wait for normal social courtesies. The rider proved to be James Fletcher, a mining surveyor known throughout the territory for his expertise in mineral assessment and his reputation for absolute honesty. He dismounted near the assembled group, removing his hat respectfully, but with an urgency that suggested his news couldn't wait for proper introductions. Mr. Boone, he called out, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. I've been looking for you since yesterday. I have news about your land that requires immediate attention. Elias felt a flutter of unease. The last thing he needed in the middle of this confrontation was additional complications regarding his modest ranch. Mr. Fletcher, perhaps this could wait. No, sir, it cannot wait. Not when there are legal proceedings being threatened that could affect mineral rights and property ownership. Fletcher's gaze swept over the assembled lawyers and carriages. In fact, it appears my timing might be providential. Charles Langford stepped forward, his business instincts engaged despite his personal anger. What mineral rights? This is cattle country, not mining territory. Fletcher reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather portfolio, thick with documents and maps. That's where you're wrong, Mr. Langford. I've just completed a comprehensive survey of this section, commissioned by the Territorial Mining Authority. Mr. Boone, your property sits directly over one of the richest silver deposits discovered in this territory. The words hit the assembled group like a thunderbolt. Elias stared at the surveyor in disbelief, while Beatrice gripped his arm with sudden understanding. Preston Whitmore's expression shifted from anger to confusion, and even Charles Langford looked genuinely surprised. That's impossible, Elias said weakly. This land has been in my family for 15 years. If there were valuable minerals here, wouldn't someone have discovered them before now? Silver deposits aren't always obvious from surface examination, Fletcher explained, spreading one of his maps on the porch railing. It often requires deep core sampling and chemical analysis to confirm their presence and extent. The Territorial Authority commissioned this survey as part of a broader mineral assessment program. He pointed to marks on the map that meant nothing to Elias, but seemed to fascinate Charles Langford. Based on my measurements and assays, I estimate the deposits on your property are worth approximately $50,000, possibly more with proper extraction methods. The silence that followed was broken only by Preston Whitmore's strangled exclamation of disbelief. $50,000 was more money than most people saw in a lifetime, enough to fund Sarah's treatment 100 times over, enough to transform Elias from a struggling rancher into one of the wealthiest men in the territory. You're certain of these findings? Charles Langford asked, his legal and business instincts taking precedence over his paternal anger. I stake my professional reputation on them, Fletcher replied. The ore samples have been independently verified by assays in 3 different cities. Mr. Boone, you've been sitting on a fortune without knowing it. Elias felt the world shift around him as the implications sank in. His desperate plan to marry Beatrice for access to medical care, the humiliation of begging for help, the terrible choice between love and family duty, all of it had been based on a poverty that was apparently illusory. I don't understand, he said, his voice hollow with shock. If this land is so valuable, why am I barely scraping by? Why couldn't I afford Sarah's treatment? Fletcher folded his map carefully. Because silver in the ground isn't the same as money in the bank, Mr. Boone. Extracting and processing the ore requires significant initial investment, specialized equipment, and partnerships with companies that have the expertise to handle large-scale mining operations. However, Charles Langford interjected, his tone completely changed from a few minutes earlier. A man who owns proven mineral deposits of that magnitude has considerable collateral for securing those investments. The irony was devastating. Elias had been wealthy all along theoretically, at least, but without the knowledge or connections to access that wealth. His sister had nearly died because he didn't understand the value of the land beneath his feet, and he'd entered into a marriage of desperation with a woman who was beginning to look at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Beatrice, he said urgently, turning to face her, I swear to you, I had no idea. This changes everything about our arrangement, about why I asked you to. Does it? She interrupted, her voice quiet but intense. Does it really change everything? Elias? The question hung between them like a bridge over dangerous waters. Preston Whitmore stepped forward with renewed confidence, apparently believing the revelation of Elias's hidden wealth would somehow restore his own position. Well, this certainly puts a different complexion on things, Preston declared. Beatrice, surely you can see that this man has deceived you about his circumstances. This entire marriage was based on false pretenses. Was it? Beatrice asked, her gaze never leaving Elias's face. Were you pretending to love your sister, Elias? Were you pretending to be desperate enough to risk everything for her life? No, but were you pretending when you told me you'd fallen in love with me? The question cut to the heart of everything, stripping away the layers of circumstance and complication to reveal the simple truth beneath. Elias looked into her eyes and saw not accusation, but something that might have been hope. No, he said simply. That was the most honest thing I've ever said. Charles Langford watched this exchange with the calculating expression of a man reassessing a complex business situation. Gentlemen, he said to his lawyers, I believe we need to reconsider our approach to this matter. Sir? One of them replied, clearly confused by the rapidly changing circumstances. My daughter has apparently married a man of considerable means, even if he was unaware of those means at the time. That changes the legal and social implications significantly. Preston's face reddened with outrage. Charles, you can't be serious. This changes nothing about the fact that Beatrice was committed to marry me. Actually, Preston, it changes everything. Langford's voice carried a finality that suggested the conversation was over. My daughter is legally married to a property owner whose assets rival our own family's holdings. Any previous understanding between our families is obviously void. But he deceived her. Did he? Beatrice stepped forward, her voice carrying a strength that commanded attention. "He told me he was poor and desperate, and he was lack of ready. Cash is still poverty, regardless of theoretical mineral wealth. He told me he would do anything to save his sister's life, and he proved that by risking social humiliation to ask for my help. Most importantly, he told me he was falling in love with me, and I believe him." She turned to face her father directly. What he didn't tell me, because he didn't know it himself, was that he was sitting on a fortune. "But you know what, Father?" "I'm glad he didn't know, because it means that when he asked me to marry him, it was for the right reasons. When I said yes, it was because I saw the kind of man he really was, not because I was impressed by his assets." Fletcher cleared his throat. "Diplomatically, if I might suggest, there are legal documents that need to be filed to establish Mr. Boone's mineral rights, and time is of considerable importance. Word of discoveries like this tends to spread quickly, and claim jumpers are always a concern." "Charles." Langford nodded briskly. "Of course, Mr. Boone, I suggest you accompany Mr. Fletcher to the territorial office immediately to secure your claims. My lawyers can assist with the paperwork. Consider it a wedding gift to my daughter." The rapid transformation from adversary to ally left Elias feeling dizzy. "Mr. Langford, I appreciate the offer, but I don't want there to be any confusion about my intentions regarding Beatrice. I didn't know about the silver when I asked her to marry me." "I believe you," Langford replied, studying Elias with new respect. "But more importantly, my daughter believes you, and I've learned over the years that her judgment of character is usually superior to my own." As the reality of his situation began to sink in, Elias felt a mixture of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming responsibility. Sarah would receive the best medical care available, not as charity, but as a right he could now afford. His marriage to Beatrice, which had begun as desperation disguised as convenience, could continue as a genuine partnership between equals. But the knowledge that their entire relationship had been built on a misunderstanding of his circumstances created a new kind of uncertainty. Would Beatrice have agreed to marry him if she'd known he was wealthy? Would he have had the courage to approach her if he'd understood his own worth? "What happens now?" he asked, looking between Beatrice and her father. "Now," Beatrice said, taking his hand with a firmness that suggested she'd made her decision, "we figure out how to build a real marriage on the foundation of what we've already discovered about each other. The silver doesn't change who you are, Elias. It just changes what's possible for our future." As the assembled group began to disperse, Fletcher heading toward town with precious mineral claims, the lawyers packing away papers they no longer needed, Preston departing in furious silence, Elias and Beatrice found themselves alone again, facing a future that had been transformed in the space of a single conversation. The man who had knocked on her door as a desperate cowboy was now revealed as one of the territory's most promising landowners. But more importantly, he was still the man who would risk everything for love, and she was still the woman brave enough to answer his impossible request. The silver would change their circumstances, but it was their characters that would determine their happiness. The telegram arrived 2 days after the mineral survey revelation, delivered by a boy whose urgent knocking interrupted the careful planning sessions that had consumed Elias and Beatrice's time since learning of their unexpected fortune. The message was brief but devastating. Sarah's condition deteriorating rapidly. New complications. Return immediately. Dr. Morrison. Elias read the words twice, his hands trembling as the implications sank in. All their careful arrangements, all the hope that had sustained them through the confrontations and revelations of recent days, none of it would matter if Sarah slipped away while they focused on mineral rights and marriage complications. "We leave for Denver immediately," Beatrice said, already moving toward the door before Elias could respond. Her decisive action reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her, not just her beauty or social position, but her ability to focus on what truly mattered when crisis demanded clear thinking. The journey back to Denver passed in a blur of dust, worry, and the kind of urgent travel that left no time for the comfortable conversations that had been developing between them. Tom Rodriguez drove his wagon harder than was wise, responding to Elias's obvious desperation with the loyalty of a true friend. Mrs. Chun, who had insisted on accompanying them, sat in stoic silence that somehow provided more comfort than words could have offered. They arrived at the sanitarium as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed cruelly beautiful given the circumstances that had brought them there. Dr. Morrison met them at the entrance, his expression grave, but not hopeless, a distinction that Elias clung to as they followed him through the antiseptic corridors toward Sarah's room. The treatments were progressing well, Dr. Morrison explained as they walked, but yesterday she developed a severe fever that hasn't responded to our usual protocols. Her breathing has become more labored, and she's been drifting in and out of consciousness. Elias felt his heart constrict with familiar fear, the same helpless terror that had driven him to Beatrice's door in the first place. What can be done? There's a new treatment, still experimental, that might help. It involves a more aggressive approach to clearing her lungs, but it's risky and expensive. Cost isn't a concern. Elias interrupted, thinking of the silver deposits that had transformed their circumstances. Whatever she needs. Dr. Morrison nodded. I hoped you'd say that. Dr. Harrison from Johns Hopkins is in town consulting on another case. He's the foremost expert in these experimental treatments, but he'll need to begin immediately if there's to be any chance of success. They reached Sarah's room, and Elias felt his composure nearly shatter at the sight of his sister. The vibrant woman who had teased him about his growing feelings for Beatrice now lay pale and still against white pillows, her breathing shallow and labored. But when she heard their voices, her eyes opened and fixed on his face with unmistakable recognition. And love? Elias, she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying infinite warmth. You came back. Of course I came back, he said, taking her hand and feeling how fragile it had become. We're going to get you the best treatment available, Sarah. Dr. Harrison from Johns Hopkins is here, and he has new methods that can help you. Sarah's gaze shifted to Beatrice, who had moved to stand beside the bed with tears visible in her eyes. How are you, dear one? Marriage seems to agree with you both. We're fine, Sarah, Beatrice said softly. The important thing now is getting you well. A smile ghosted across Sarah's pale features. I have something for you both. In my bag. There's a letter I wrote when I was feeling stronger. I wanted you to have it in case. Don't talk like that, Elias said firmly. You're going to recover, and you can tell us whatever you wanted to say in person. But Sarah had already closed her eyes, the brief conversation having exhausted her limited energy. Dr. Morrison gestured for them to follow him back to the corridor, where he could speak more freely about the treatment options. Dr. Harrison is prepared to begin the experimental therapy tonight, he said. It involves a surgical procedure to clear the infected tissue from her lungs, followed by a new type of medication that's shown promise in similar cases. But I must be honest with you, the procedure itself is dangerous, and her weakened condition makes the risks even greater. What are her chances without the treatment? Beatrice asked. Dr. Morrison's expression grew even more grave. Without intervention. I believe she has perhaps a week, maybe less. The choice was stark and terrible, but Elias knew there was really no choice at all. When can Dr. Harrison begin? He's preparing now. The procedure will take several hours, and recovery, if successful, will require weeks of careful monitoring. I should warn you that even if everything goes perfectly, she faces a long and difficult healing process. As they waited for the surgery to begin, Elias and Beatrice found themselves alone in the sanitarium's small chapel, a quiet space where families could pray or simply sit with their thoughts during medical crises. The letter Sarah had mentioned lay between them on the wooden pew, her familiar handwriting visible through the thin paper. Should we read it now? Beatrice asked softly. Elias picked up the envelope, noting how his sister had written both their names across the front in her careful script. She said it was in case. I think we should wait. When she's recovered, she can tell us what it says herself. And if she doesn't recover? The question hung between them like a shadow, acknowledging the possibility neither wanted to voice. Elias looked at the letter in his hands, then at the woman who had risked everything to help a stranger sister, and felt the weight of decisions that could reshape their entire future. Beatrice, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. If Sarah doesn't survive this, if the experimental treatment fails, and we lose her, will you still want to stay married to me? Or was your willingness to make this real dependent on the happy ending we thought we were building toward? Beatrice turned to face him fully, her expression serious and intent. Are you asking whether I love you only when circumstances are favorable? I'm asking whether you're prepared for the possibility that our marriage might begin with grief instead of joy. Whether you can build a life with a man who might always carry the weight of losing the most important person in his world. Elias, she said, taking his hands in hers, when I agreed to marry you for one day, I thought I was helping a stranger save his sister's life. When I realized I was falling in love with you, I thought I was discovering something wonderful and unexpected. But if Sarah doesn't survive tonight, I'll be learning something else entirely, how to love someone through the worst loss imaginable. And you're willing to do that? I'm willing to try, because the man I've fallen in love with is someone who would move mountains for the people he cares about. Someone who sees beauty in simple things and finds poetry in everyday moments. Someone whose capacity for love is so deep that losing Sarah would break his heart, but not his ability to eventually heal and love again. Before Elias could respond, Dr. Morrison appeared in the chapel doorway. Dr. Harrison is ready to begin. If you'd like to see Sarah before the surgery... They returned to her room, where Sarah had been prepared for the procedure. Despite her weakened condition, she was conscious and alert, her eyes bright with the same intelligence and warmth that had always defined her. I want you both to know, she said, her voice stronger than it had been earlier, that whatever happens tonight, these past few weeks have been the happiest of my life. Not because of the treatment, though I'm grateful for it, but because I've watched my brother discover what real love looks like. She looked directly at Beatrice. Take care of him for me, dear one. He pretends to be strong enough to handle anything, but he needs someone who sees the poetry in his soul. I will, Beatrice promised, tears streaming down her face. Sarah's gaze returned to Elias. And you take care of her. She's braver than she knows, and stronger than she believes. Together, you two can weather any storm. As they wheeled Sarah toward a surgical suite, Elias felt as if he were watching his past and future collide in a moment that would define everything that came after. The experimental treatment would either save the sister who had been his anchor through every hardship, or cost him the last connection to his childhood and the family that had shaped him. But as he stood beside Beatrice in the corridor, watching the surgical doors close behind Sarah's gurney, he realized that whatever the outcome, he wouldn't face it alone. The woman who had agreed to marry him for one day had become his partner in hoping, grieving, and believing in the possibility that love could sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The next few hours would determine whether their marriage would be blessed with the presence of the sister who had made it possible, or whether they would begin their life together in the shadow of loss. Either way, they would face the future together, bound by promises that had grown from convenience into conviction, from necessity into love. The surgical waiting room at midnight felt like a place suspended between worlds, too quiet for the living, too full of desperate hope for the dying. Elias paced the small space with restless energy, his cavalry medal pressing against his chest. Beneath his shirt, a reminder of other battles fought and survived. Beatrice sat in one of the hard wooden chairs, her hands clasped in her lap, watching him with the patient attention of someone who understood that some kinds of waiting required movement while others demanded stillness. They had been alone for 2 hours since Dr. Harrison disappeared behind the surgical doors with Sarah. 2 hours of watching the clock, hands move with agonizing slowness while trying to maintain hope in the face of impossible odds. The experimental surgery was their last chance, the final throw of dice in a game where the stakes were measured in heartbeats, and the currency was love itself. Tell me about the medal, Beatrice said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched. Between them, like a taut wire dot, Elias stopped pacing and touched his chest instinctively. How did you know? I've seen you touch it when you're worried. During the confrontation with my father, when we were planning the trip to Denver, tonight, while we were waiting for news about the surgery. He sat down beside her for the first time in hours, suddenly exhausted by the weight of carrying so much fear alone. It was my father's. He earned it during the war between the states, at a battle where his regiment held a bridge against overwhelming odds. When he gave it to me before I enlisted, He said it wasn't about the courage to fight, but about the courage to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. Is that what you're doing now? Fighting when everything seems lost? Elias looked at her, this remarkable woman who had entered his life as a practical solution to an impossible problem, and somehow become the person he couldn't imagine living without. I'm trying to, but I've never faced a battle where I couldn't do anything but wait. You're not waiting, Elias. You're loving. You brought Sarah here. You made sure she had the best possible treatment. You've given her every chance to survive. Sometimes love means fighting, and sometimes it means trusting others to fight for you. Before he could respond, the surgical doors opened and Dr. Harrison emerged, still wearing his surgical gown and carrying the grim expression of a man who had just waged war against death itself. Elias and Beatrice rose as one, their hands instinctively finding each other as they prepared to hear news that would reshape their understanding of the future. The surgery was successful, Dr. Harrison said without preamble, and Elias felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. We were able to remove the infected tissue and clear her breathing passages. Her heart remained strong throughout the procedure, which is encouraging given her overall condition. Then she's going to recover? Beatrice asked. Dr. Harrison's expression remained cautious. The next 48 hours will be critical. Her body needs to respond positively to the new medication and begin the healing process. But I can tell you that her vital signs are stable, and she survived a procedure that would have been impossible even 5 years ago. Can we see her? Briefly. She's unconscious from the anesthesia, but hearing familiar voices may help orient her as she begins to wake up. They followed Dr. Harrison back through the corridors that had become as familiar as the rooms of their own homes, past other patients fighting their own battles against illness and injury. Sarah's room had been transformed into something resembling a field hospital, with additional equipment monitoring her breathing and heart rate, tubes and wires that looked intimidating, but represented the cutting edge of medical science. Sarah herself looked impossibly small against the white linens, her face pale but peaceful, her breathing assisted by a mechanical device that expanded and contracted with rhythmic precision. But she was alive, and the monitors showed the steady patterns of a heart that refused to surrender. Sarah, Elias said softly, taking her hand and feeling warmth that had been absent during her fever. The surgery went well. Dr. Harrison says you're going to be fine. Beatrice moved to the other side of the bed, her voice gentle as she added, We're both here, dear one. You just focus on getting strong again. For a moment, Sarah's eyelids fluttered as if she were trying to respond, and Elias felt a surge of hope that perhaps the worst was truly behind them. But Dr. Harrison gestured them back toward the corridor, mindful of his patient's need for rest. The nursing staff will monitor her continuously, he assured them. If there are any changes, you'll be notified immediately. For now, the best thing you can do is get some rest yourselves. The next few days will require all your strength. They found rooms at a nearby hotel, but sleep proved elusive despite their exhaustion. Elias lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the day, from the terror of receiving Dr. Morrison's telegram to the cautious hope in Dr. Harrison's voice. The surgery had been successful, but he understood enough about medical procedures to know that success was measured in stages, not single moments. Somewhere in the building next door, Sarah was fighting for her life with the assistance of the most advanced medical science available. The experimental treatment might save her, or it might simply delay the inevitable. There was no way to know which outcome awaited them, no guarantee that their desperate gamble would pay off. But as he lay there in the hotel room darkness, Elias realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of courage and love. For weeks, he had carried the burden of Sarah's illness, as if her survival depended entirely on his ability to solve an impossible problem. The marriage to Beatrice, the discovery of mineral wealth, the confrontation with her father, all of it had been driven by his desperate need to control circumstances that were ultimately beyond his control. Now, in the quiet hours after the surgery, he understood that love wasn't about solving problems or controlling outcomes. It was about standing witness to another person's struggle, about being present for joy and sorrow alike, about choosing to remain connected even when connection meant sharing pain. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Beatrice standing in the hallway, her hair loose around her shoulders, and her expression vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply. "Neither could I." She entered his room without invitation, moving to the window that looked out toward the sanitarium where Sarah lay fighting for her future. "I keep thinking about what she said before the surgery, about watching you discover what real love looks like." "What about it?" "I think she was wrong about one thing. I don't think you discovered love these past few weeks. I think you've always known how to love deeply and completely. What you discovered was someone who could love you back the same way." Elias moved to stand beside her at the window, their shoulders almost touching as they looked toward the building where Sarah's life hung in the balance. "Are you saying you love me the way I love Sarah?" "I'm saying I love you the way you love completely, without reservation, regardless of circumstances or outcomes. When I agreed to marry you for one day, I thought I was helping a stranger. When I realized I was falling in love with you, I thought I was discovering something unexpected. But tonight, watching you carry the weight of Sarah's illness with such grace and determination, I realized I was learning something much more important." "What was that?" "I was learning what it means to choose someone not just for the joy they bring to your life, but for the person they become when facing the worst challenges life can offer." As they stood together in the darkness, looking toward the place where Sarah fought for her future with the assistance of experimental medicine and their desperate hope, Elias understood that their marriage had already survived its first real test. Not the confrontation with her father or the revelation of hidden wealth, but the more fundamental challenge of discovering whether their love could sustain them through genuine crisis. Tomorrow would bring news about Sarah's recovery, about whether the experimental treatment had succeeded in giving her the future she deserved. But tonight, in the quiet hours between hope and knowledge, Elias and Beatrice had found something equally precious, the certainty that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Dawn brought Dr. Morrison to their hotel with news that transformed cautious hope into genuine celebration. Sarah had not only survived the critical 48-hour period, but her body was responding to the experimental treatment better than anyone had dared expect. Her breathing had improved dramatically, her fever had broken completely, and she was conscious and asking for her brother. Elias and Beatrice rushed to the sanitarium, where they found Sarah propped up against pillows, still weak but unmistakably herself. Her eyes were bright with intelligence and affection, and when she saw them enter her room, she managed a smile that reminded Elias of the spirited girl who had helped him work their parents' ranch all those years ago. "You both look terrible," she said, her voice still hoarse, but carrying enough strength to tease them. "Haven't you been sleeping?" "We've been worried about you," Beatrice said, taking Sarah's hand and feeling the steady warmth that signaled returning health. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle, but alive. Wonderfully, miraculously alive." Sarah's gaze moved between them, reading the exhaustion and relief on their faces. "Dr. Morrison tells me the treatment worked better than expected, that I'll need several more weeks of recovery, but that I should be able to return home by Christmas." "That's wonderful news," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, I was so afraid." "I know, rather dear, but I'm going to be fine, thanks to both of you." She squeezed Beatrice's hand gently. "I understand there have been some interesting developments while I've been unconscious. Something about silver deposits and mineral rights?" Elias and Beatrice exchanged glances, realizing they hadn't yet had time to fully process how the discovery of wealth would change their circumstances. The past few days had been so focused on Sarah's survival that the transformation of their financial situation seemed almost secondary. "It appears I've been sitting on a fortune without knowing it," Elias said. "A mining surveyor confirmed that our land contains silver deposits worth more than I could spend in several lifetimes." Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "And how does that change things between you two?" "I know your marriage began as a practical arrangement born of my medical needs." "It changes nothing about why we fell in love," Beatrice said firmly, "and everything about what's possible for our future." "Show me," Sarah said suddenly. "Show you what?" "The marriage certificate. I want to see the document that made you husband and wife." Elias reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the carefully folded paper they had signed what seemed like a lifetime ago. As Sarah examined it, her expression grew increasingly pleased. "This is beautifully done," she said finally. "Pastor, Williams has lovely handwriting, and the legal language is quite comprehensive. But there's something missing." "What do you mean?" Beatrice asked. "This certificate shows that you entered into a legal marriage for practical purposes, but it doesn't show that you've chosen to make that marriage real and permanent." Sarah folded the document carefully and handed it back to her brother. "Perhaps it's time for a proper ceremony." Before either of them could respond, the door opened to admit an unexpected visitor, Charles Langford, carrying a large basket and wearing an expression of genuine contrition that neither Elias nor Beatrice had ever seen before. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, setting down the basket, which proved to contain an assortment of books, flowers, and delicacies from Denver's finest shops. "I wanted to check on Sarah's progress and to apologize for my behavior during our last meeting." "Father," Beatrice said, clearly surprised by his presence. "What are you doing here?" "Learning that I was wrong about several important things," Charles replied, moving to Sarah's bedside with the careful attention of someone unused to sick rooms, but determined to do the right thing. "Miss Sarah, I'm Charles Langford, Beatrice's father. I'm deeply sorry that our family complications interfered with your medical treatment." "Mr. Langford," Sarah replied with gracious formality, "any complications were resolved quickly, and I received excellent care. I understand you were protecting your daughter's interests as any father would." "I was protecting what I thought were her interests," Charles corrected. "I've since learned that my daughter's judgment of character is superior to my own, and that the man she chose to marry is worthy of both her love and my respect." He turned to face Elias directly. "Mr. Boone, I owe you an apology. I accused you of fortune hunting and deception, when you were actually demonstrating the kind of character I should hope to find in a son-in-law. Your willingness to risk social humiliation for your sister's welfare speaks to a nobility that has nothing to do with financial circumstances. Mr. Langford, I understand your concerns. Furthermore," Charles continued, "I want to make a formal announcement. The Langford family recognizes and celebrates the marriage between my daughter Beatrice and her husband, Elias. We welcome him as a member of our family and look forward to supporting whatever ventures they choose to pursue together." The words carried the weight of complete social acceptance, effectively ending any gossip or speculation about the legitimacy of their union. But more importantly to Elias, they represented something he had never expected to receive: the blessing of Beatrice's family. "There's more," Charles said, reaching into his coat pocket. "I've brought something that belongs to both of you." He withdrew a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a wedding ring of simple but elegant design, white gold set with a modest diamond that caught the morning light streaming through the hospital window. This was Beatrice's mother's engagement ring, he said, offering the box to Elias. She would have wanted her daughter to wear it in a marriage based on love rather than convenience. Beatrice gasped softly, tears gathering in her eyes as she recognized the ring she had thought was lost forever. "Father, I thought you had given that to Preston." "I never gave Preston anything that belonged to your mother," Charles said firmly. "That ring was always meant for you when you found someone worthy of wearing it." Elias took the ring from the box, feeling the weight of tradition and acceptance it represented. When he looked at Beatrice, he saw in her eyes the same mixture of love and determination that had carried them through every challenge of the past weeks. "Beatrice Langford Boone," he said, using her full married name for the first time, "will you wear your mother's ring as a symbol that our marriage is real and permanent, based not on convenience or necessity, but on the love we've discovered in each other?" "Yes," she said simply, extending her hand so he could slip the ring onto her finger. "Yes, I will." As the ring settled into place, perfectly sized as if it had been made for her, Sarah clapped her hands together with delight. "Now that," she said with satisfaction, "looks like a proper marriage." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Harrison, who had come to check on his patient's progress. When he saw the small gathering around Sarah's bed, he smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had witnessed not just medical recovery, but the healing of relationships that had seemed beyond repair. "I see my patient is receiving excellent," care from her family, he observed. How are you feeling today, Sarah? Like I have many years ahead of me to enjoy, she replied. Many years to watch my brother and his wife build something beautiful together. As Dr. Harrison conducted his examination, confirming that Sarah's recovery was proceeding even better than hoped, Elias found himself holding Beatrice's hand and marveling at how completely their circumstances had changed. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save his sister's life had become the foundation for a marriage that promised happiness beyond anything he had ever imagined possible. The silver deposits would provide financial security. Charles Langford's acceptance would ensure social respectability, and Sarah's recovery would allow them to begin their married life with joy rather than grief. But most importantly, they had discovered that their love was strong enough to weather any storm, practical enough to solve real problems, and deep enough to sustain them through whatever challenges the future might bring. 6 months later, on a spring morning, when the mountain air carried the scent of wildflowers and new beginnings, Elias stood on the porch of his transformed ranch, watching his wife tend the expanded garden she had planted with Sarah's enthusiastic assistance. The silver mining operation, managed through a partnership with Charles Langford's business connections, had provided the resources to improve the property, while maintaining its essential character as a working ranch. The modest cabin had been enlarged into a comfortable house, complete with modern conveniences and a library that reflected both Beatrice's refined education and Sarah's voracious appetite for learning. But the heart of the place remained unchanged, the stone fireplace where they gathered each evening, the kitchen table where important conversations took place, the sense of home that had nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with love. Sarah emerged from the house carrying a basket of fresh bread, her cheeks pink with health and her movements energetic enough to make her brother smile with profound gratitude. The experimental treatment had not only saved her life, but restored her to better health than she had enjoyed in years. Dr. Morrison attributed her remarkable recovery to the combination of advanced medical care and the healing power of hope. Fulfilled. The new family portrait arrived from Denver yesterday, she announced, setting down her basket and producing a professionally framed photograph from beneath her shawl. Mrs. Chun picked it up from the photographer's studio. The portrait showed the three of them standing together in front of the ranch house, Elias and Beatrice positioned as husband and wife with Sarah between them, all three wearing expressions of contentment that spoke to the happiness they had found in their unconventional family arrangement. But more than individual satisfaction, the photograph captured something deeper, the sense of belonging that comes from choosing to love and be loved without reservation. It's perfect, Beatrice said, accepting the photograph and studying it. With pleasure. We should send a copy to your father, Elias. I think he would want to display it prominently in the railroad office. Charles Langford had indeed become an enthusiastic supporter of their marriage, treating Elias as the son he had never had and finding in their partnership opportunities for both business and personal satisfaction. The silver mining venture had proven profitable beyond anyone's expectations, but more importantly, it had provided a foundation for the kind of family legacy that honored both tradition and innovation. Speaking of family, Sarah said with a mysterious smile, I have news that I've been saving for the right moment. What sort of news? Elias asked, though something in his sister's expression suggested he might already know. Dr. Morrison has proposed marriage, Sarah announced with obvious joy, and I've accepted. The news brought immediate congratulations and embraces, but also a deeper satisfaction that went beyond happiness for Sarah's romantic success. Dr. Morrison was a good man whose dedication to his patients was matched by his appreciation for Sarah's intelligence and strength of character. Their courtship had developed slowly during her extended recovery, built on mutual respect and shared interests that promised a stable and loving marriage. When? Beatrice asked, already beginning to plan the celebration. This fall, after the harvest. We want a simple ceremony, much like yours, though perhaps with a few more guests, and definitely with the groom's full knowledge of his financial circumstances beforehand. They laughed together at the gentle teasing, but Elias felt a profound sense of completion at the thought of his sister finding the same kind of unexpected happiness that he had discovered with Beatrice. Sarah had sacrificed years of her own possibilities to help him maintain their family ranch. Now she would have. A chance to build a life that honored both her individual dreams and her capacity for love. Dr. Morrison is a fortunate man, Elias said seriously. Sarah, you deserve every happiness, and I believe you found someone who understands your worth. As you found someone who understands yours, Sarah replied, looking between her brother and Beatrice, with the satisfied expression of someone who had watched a perfect plan unfold exactly as hoped as the morning progressed into the kind of peaceful afternoon that made their early struggles seem like events from another lifetime. Elias found himself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of circumstances that had brought them to this moment. His desperate proposal to a stranger had led to genuine love. The discovery of hidden wealth had provided security without corrupting their values. Sarah's medical crisis had been resolved through a combination of advanced science and determined care. But perhaps most remarkably, their marriage of convenience had evolved into something that strengthened with each passing day. Beatrice had brought to their partnership not just social grace and business acumen, but a warmth and intelligence that made their home a place of genuine contentment. She had adapted to ranch life with the same determination she brought to every challenge, learning to appreciate the rhythms of agricultural work while contributing her own skills to their shared enterprises. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, joining him on the porch as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. "I'm thinking about how much has changed since that evening when I knocked on your door with an impossible request, and how the impossible turned out to be exactly what we both needed, even though neither of us could have planned for it." Beatrice took his hand, her mother's ring catching the afternoon light as a reminder of the traditions they honored and the future they were building together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had said no that night?" "Sometimes. But then I remember what Sarah told us about trusting in the possibility that life might surprise us. I think if you had said no, we would have found some other way to discover each other. Some people are meant to be together, regardless of the circumstances that bring them to that recognition. Even if one of them is a poor cowboy and the other is a rich woman." "Especially then," Elias said, pulling her closer. "Because those differences taught us that love isn't about matching circumstances. It's about matching souls." As evening settled over their ranch, bringing with it the familiar sounds of cattle moving toward shelter and birds settling into their fur roosts, the three members of this unconventional family gathered around their dinner table for another meal shared in gratitude and affection. Sarah regaled them with stories from her correspondence with other patients she had met during her treatment. Beatrice shared news from her ongoing charitable work in town, and Elias reported on the progress of their spring planting. But beyond the practical details of their daily lives, there was something deeper at work, the quiet satisfaction that comes from building something lasting based on love, sacrifice, and the courage to believe in possibilities that others might dismiss as impossible. Later, after Sarah had retired to her room to write letters, and Elias and Beatrice sat together by the fireplace, she asked the question that had been on both their minds as they watched their family expand and flourish. "Are you happy, Elias? Really, truly happy with how everything turned out?" He considered the question seriously, looking around the comfortable room that represented not just material improvement, but emotional fulfillment. Sarah was healthy and planning her own marriage to a man who loved her. Their ranch was prosperous, and their future secure. Most importantly, he was married to a woman who challenged him to be better while accepting him exactly as he was. "I am happy," he said finally. "But more than that, I'm grateful. Grateful that desperation led me to your door. Grateful that you were brave enough to say yes. And grateful that we were both wise enough to recognize that what we found together was worth fighting for. Even though it began with deception. Even though I didn't know you were actually wealthy. Especially because of that. Because it means that when you agreed to marry me, you were responding to who I really was, not what I could offer you. And when I asked you to marry me, it was because I was desperate enough to be completely honest about what I needed." As they sat together in the comfortable silence of people who had learned to appreciate both conversation and quietude, Elias understood that their story had become exactly what the best love stories should be, not a fairy tale where everything works out easily, but a real-life account of two people choosing to build something beautiful from the raw materials of necessity. Courage and unexpected grace. Outside their windows, the ranch that had once represented struggle and limitation now embodied possibility and hope. Inside their home, the family that had been formed through crisis and determination had become a source of joy that enriched not just their own lives, but the entire community around them. The poor cowboy who had asked a rich woman to be his wife, for just one day, had discovered that some requests, no matter how impossible they seem, carry within them the seeds of transformations that last a lifetime. And the woman who had agreed to help a stranger save his sister's life had learned that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simple word yes. Their marriage certificate, framed and hanging in the place of honor above their fireplace, bore witness to vows that had been spoken in desperation but fulfilled in love. Below it, the new family portrait showed three people whose lives had been forever intertwined by one brave decision made on a Tuesday evening when hope seemed impossible and love was just beginning to bloom. In the end, it had been exactly as Sarah predicted. The most important things couldn't be planned in advance. But sometimes life surprised you with gifts beyond anything you had dared to imagine possible.